Greetings, everyone. So, today's topic is a pest to mental health and its effect of consuming agrichemical food. So, the areas that will be covered during this presentation include introduction, what are agrichemicals, and what are the mental health outcomes related to it, and the research work done in this field. So, we all know that mental health is a complex concept. It affects how we think, feel, and act, and it encompasses our emotional, psychological, and social well being. For decades, research has basically focused on the effect of agrichemical on farmers' mental health, and it is an important area of concern, but another growing area of concern is the impact of these agrochemical residue on the mental health of the consumers. And recent research has been focused in this particular area as well in order to educate the public and identify preventive measures. So now moving on to what are agrochemicals. So Agrichemicals is a broader term that encompasses various synthetic chemicals used to enhance crop yield. Some of the common types include pesticides. These are used to target living organisms that harm the crops, and these include insecticides, herbicides. Next are fertilizers. These are used to enhance the crop growth and yield by providing essential nutrients to the crop. Next are growth regulators. Regulators are basically chemicals used to manipulate plant growth and processes like delaying fruit ripening or promoting denser growth. Now, there are certain benefits and drawbacks attached to the use of agrochemicals. So, the benefits include increased crop yield. So, these agrochemicals minimize crop loss and ensure that there is an abundant harvest. Now, they also protect the crop from being damaged, so their appearance and taste and nutritional value is retained. Hence, it maintains a appealing food supply. It also reduces labor cost. Let's say, for example, um, significant labor cost is reduced when manual weeding is not required because one uses herbicides. Now, there are certain agrochemicals that target specific pests or disease that threaten specific crops. So these crops are also protected. But there are certain drawbacks attached to the use of agrochemicals as well. So these include agrochemical runoff can contaminate soil and water sources that harm beneficial organisms and potentially the food chain as well. Now, with constant use of agrochemicals, certain pesticides can lead to um, pest developing resistance, which renders the chemicals ineffective over time. Some insecticides can also harm pollinators, like bees, for example, who are a crucial part of plant reproduction. Now, there are potential health risks also involved. Exposure to agrochemicals, particularly for farmers who are directly in contact with these chemicals, include health risks like respiratory problems, skin irritation, and chronic health issues as well. Now, moving ahead to the exposure of these agrochemicals, consumers are directly exposed to agrochemicals by the residue that is present in the food products. The factors that influence these exposure are related to the dietary habit and dietary intake of these consumers. So, high consumption of non-organic produce like fruits and vegetables can increase the exposure rate to these agrochemicals. Products like fatty dairy and meat could also have agrichemical residue because of bioaccumulation. Now, this exposure can be assessed through biological and environmental monitoring and dietary surveys. So, biological monitoring is um, breaking down the products that are present in the blood samples of the consumers to identify the exposure rate. Or environmental monitoring includes measuring the agrochemical levels in air, water, and soil to assess the potential contamination. Dietary surveys include assessing the dietary habits of the consumers to have an estimate of potential intake of agrochemical residue. Now, there are certain common food items that do contain agrochemical residue in a higher quantity. So, these include leafy greens like spinach, mustard greens, since they have a higher surface area to a volume ratio, they usually tend to trap more pesticide residue. Now, okra is another such example. Grapes and berries are also another example. Since they have thin skin that offer less protection against residue, they are also a high risk of having a higher rate of agrochemical residue. Now, bell peppers are another example, and all of the non organic food items. So, organic produce generally has a lower agrochemical residue as compared to non-organic produce. So these are certain common food items that one can avoid or one can focus on using the organic produce in context of these food items. Next, we will discuss about the mental health outcomes and Shikha will take over from here.
Thank you, Jhanvi. Good morning, everyone. So, next slide. According to the existing research on effect of consuming agrichemical food on consumers' health, which is ongoing, however, still emerging with evidences that suggest potential connections. While definitive conclusions are still challenging due to the complexity of the topic and the multitude of the variables involved, several key points have emerged from the existing studies and the literature so far. First, if we talk about is pesticide exposure and neurotoxicity. So, certain pesticide used in agriculture have been associated with the neurotoxic effects, which has been shown in the studies. So, these chemicals can interfere with the neurotransmitter function that disrupt your neuronal signal pathways and potentially contributing to neurodegenerative disorders or cognitive impairment. So, chronic exposure to neurotoxic pesticides has been linked to increased risk of depression, anxiety, and other mental health issues. Second is endocrine disruption. Certain pesticide and herbicides possess endocrine disrupting properties, which can interfere with the hormone production, regulation, signaling in the body. Disruption to endocrine system have been implicated in mood disorders and such as again depression, anxiety, and other cognitive functions. Uh, Third is inflammation and oxidative stress, which is again being associated with increased levels of inflammation and oxidative state in the body, um, creating the chronic inflammation, which can negatively impact brain health and contribute to the development of mental health disorders, causing neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. Saying this, although more evidences are required here. So now fourth is gut microbiota alteration. Uh, this may also disrupt the gut microbiota, which plays a crucial role in regulating mood, cognition, and behavior through the gut-brain axis. Fifth is individual variability and vulnerability, which needs to be kept in mind always that um, when we're talking about the effects of agrochemical exposure and the mental health outcome, it can largely based on factors such as genetics, age, sex, pre existing health conditions, and other lifestyle factors. So, we have seen that certain populations, such as children, pregnant women, and individuals, have compromised immune system, may be particularly vulnerable to neurotoxic and endocrine disrupting effects on agrochemicals. And last, cumulative exposure and long term effects. This may have, again, the synergistic and additive effects of neurodevelopmental issues and brain functions, mental well being, along with what we have covered in last 5 points. Next slide, please. Uh, Now, backing this, we have some research here. Um, So, India, major agriculture producer, heavily relies on agrochemicals. However, research on the link between the consumer exposure and the mental health is thus uh, context is again limited. But growing. So, empirical research, if we talk about, suggests a possible association between the pesticide exposure and the depressions in Indians, which also points towards a correlation between the organophosphate exposure and the cognitive decline in elderly population. So, in brief, we will cover this all in some time. But before we talk about these studies and highlight the need for further research on this, we are required to be mindful of factors that influences this. So, first is dietary patterns. So, high consumption of fruits and vegetables with potential agrochemical residues is always at the high risk. The second is socio-economic status. So, lower income population may have limited access to the organic and or residue-free produce, increasing the exposure risk. Then we have this potential mechanism that we have already spoken about, the neurotoxicity, endocrine disruption, uh, that impacts that we spoke about while on the previous slide. And other than this, we have demographic and contextual factors, which includes gender, age, occupation, living location. So, for example, in gender, when we talk about women, particularly those involved in agricultural activities or food processing, might have higher exposure risk. Age, if we talk about now the children or the elderly population may be more vulnerable to the effects of agrochemical exposure on the nervous system. Occupation, so people working in the agriculture related industries, so uh, people from the farming or the food processing industries may have higher exposure. uh, Location, so individual residing near farms or areas where this intensive agriculture practices are going on are always on the higher exposure levels. So far we know the effects of chemicals on consumers mental health, but its significance in our life, how it signifies its impact on our life on the daily basis. So, first, it increases the consumer's burden, which is us. So, when there is increased rate of depression or neurodegenerative diseases there, the individual's well-being, productivity, and quality of life all will be affected. Then we have second is the agricultural communities. They will be largely affected, which can lead to decreased productivity, financial strain, social isolation among the farmers and their families, which brings us to the climax. And that is the surge in the economic cost. So, when the mental health practices can strain the healthcare resources and lead to increased cost of treatment, leading to the uh, productivity loss. Now, backing all this, we have some research. Can I have a next slide, please? So, yeah. So, in 2018, this review published in the Frontier Psychiatry, um, which explored a link between the herbicide exposure and the mental health. This highlighted an association between herbicide exposure, particularly glyphosate based herbicide, and increased risk of anxiety disorder, emphasizing the potential negative impact on the mental health. So, glyphosate, a common herbicide which used in modern agriculture, was specifically implicated in potentially influencing the neurodevelopmental and behavioral issues, raising concerns about its effect on the mental well-being. We have next slide. We have another study which is in 2019 published by Environmental Health Perspective, found an association between the prenatal exposure to the pesticide and increased risk of ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, in children. So, a study reviewed the observational studies. This is an observational study, and found that prenatal exposure to the organophosphate and the prethyroid pesticide was linked to an increased risk of ADHD and related traits. So, additionally, a subgroup analysis also happened, which found an increased risk of autism spectrum disorder and the ADHD in offspring also can be associated with the maternal pesticide exposure. We have a couple of more. Next slide, please. So now in 2020 review, the Lancet Planetary Health highlights the potential link between the exposure to certain pesticide and increased risk of neurodegenerative diseases such as Parkinson and Alzheimer. Epidemiologic evidences suggest that exposure to various pesticides, including insecticide and herbicide and fungicide, increase the risk of neurodegenerative disease. Uh, Chronic exposure to the pesticide at low doses is a huge risk factor. So, epigenetics may play a role in pesticide induced neurotoxicity, which exposure to pesticide having a long term effects on a central nervous system, possibly via epigenetic modification, which can be only treated by the medicines or, yeah, largely on the medicines as a therapeutic tool. So next we have in 2021, this study has been published in Science of Food, identified in indirect effects on the mental health due to increased exposure to pesticide. This study also found out that heightened exposure to the pesticide was associated with an increased risk of diabetes and heart disease, which in turn can have an indirect impacts on mental health. Nonetheless, we have to be mindful of the other lifestyle factors of the person we are assessing. So, overall, a multi pronged approach involving policy changes, education initiatives, and the strengthened healthcare system is crucial to address the mental health concerns linked to agrichemical exposure in India. Next slide, please. So, what uh, are the common food items with high agrichemical residue? Anybody? Right. Um, Next slide, Jhanvi. So, what are the drawbacks related to the agrichemicals? Yes. Right, Chitraneva. Thank you so much. So that this brings us to the end of the presentation. If there's any question, the floor is yours.
That was an informative presentation.